Thank you, Amy. So we're going to have three perspectives. We're going to have the participant perspective and the researcher perspective. So we're going to start with Jeri. So Jeri is the Director of Patient Initiatives at Healthy Vibe, LLC. She is also the founder of Partners in Research and speaks publicly on the topic of clinical trial participation. Through her work at Partners in Research, she is dedicated to raising awareness about clinical trials. By sharing experiences and providing information, she hopes to remove the anxiety over the unknown that patients might feel when considering participation. In her role at Healthy Vibe, Jeri helps patients contribute to the design of clinical trials, resulting in faster, more effective, and less expensive research and development. The company is guided by the premise that patients should play a more instrumental and active role in clinical studies before they're designed and conducted and throughout the entire patient journey. Welcome, Jeri.
Thank you. First, I would like to thank the NIH and Vanderbilt University for inviting me to represent the patient voice on the proposed changes to the informed consent. Special thanks to Tara Helmer for getting me here. She did a phenomenal job bringing it all together. So, a little bit about me and why I was invited to speak. I was diagnosed with MS in 1999, and I spent 8 years on a therapy that wasn't working for me. I was sick and tired of being sick all the time, and I was contemplating suicide. But in 2007, I found a new neurologist who suggested joining a clinical trial. But I'm a hypochondriac, and I felt compelled to search for any information I could find about what being in a trial was like. The fact that I found nothing didn't dissuade me from joining, but it's why I ultimately decided to blog my own study. My blog then caught the eye of pharma and resulted in what has become an ongoing conversation with researchers about the patient experience in clinical trials. Joining that study changed my life so profoundly and improved my quality of life so much that now I'm dedicated to raising awareness about the need for volunteers and to help make the entire trial experience more patient-friendly through my work at Healthy Vibe. So, going back to my very first trial, because I've taken part in several to date, let's take a look at my original informed consent. You can see from the highlighted sections that it wasn't very patient-friendly. Right off the bat, the title of the document has me identified as a research subject, which we've already discussed in the comments. But to me, I feel that's dehumanizing and dismissive of the importance of my role. Then along the left side, you see words that aren't used in everyday conversation. Words like protocol, sponsor, and investigator all have quite different meanings to the average person than they do when used in research. There are 15 pages to this informed consent, with each one just as indigestible as the one before. Where it talks about the number of visits further into the document, it says X number of visits, but those may be broken up into several visits according to scheduling availability. So, well, which is it? 10 visits or maybe 30 visits? Because a 2-hour trip takes a huge chunk of my time and money. I know researchers love to use words like randomization. In the world of science, it has a very succinct meaning, but when a patient's first visit is defined by a word that sounds scary, maybe it's time to rethink that. The phrase randomly assigned to one of the study groups may not be as sexy, but at least it conveys the meaning more clearly. This informed consent also placed enormous focus on the possible risks. Granted, there were many known risks for the medication, but the possible benefits were buried back in the back in only 3 short paragraphs. And that basically told me that there were no promises or guarantees. Even the signature line refers to me as a subject. But that was a different time, and I forgive whoever wrote that informed consent. I think going forward, we're going to do a much better job, and that's why I'm here today. I did an informal poll when I found out I was going to be here on social media to find out what other people thought was important about the proposed changes, and if they had a voice in the matter, what would they say? So a lot of them felt very strongly that patients need to be included, real patients, in the writing of the informed consent, to let them help define what is most important to include up front. I mean, saying you need to include the most important things to make the decision, well, who decides that? I think patients should have an enormous say. So next, don't assume Flesch Kincaid knows best. They also want to see it simplified in lay language, but don't assume that running it through a grade level checker is adequate, because you could use a term like rescue therapy, which, for instance, may score appropriately, but when the patient reads that, they're scared, thinking they're going to need to be rescued. In reality, maybe all you meant by that was Tylenol. And if that's what you mean, then say that. Using language that can't be so easily misconstrued. Don't use acronyms. I know people in government and academia are fond of these shortcuts, but as far as layman terms are concerned, if you have to resort to acronyms, perhaps you should rethink how you word what it stands for to begin with. I can't tell you how many times, ever since I was invited here to speak today, I've had to look up what NPRM means. And to me, this, I live and breathe research from a patient perspective, and if it's that hard for me to figure this stuff out, just imagine how scary it is and confusing to the people that are faced with life and death decisions at the lowest, most vulnerable points in their life. And you can see that, it's been 8 years since my first trial, and I'm still touched by this. It was a really scary time. So regional and demographic patient considerations, going back to consulting patients for deciding which things in the informed consent are most important. Be sure to work with patients who match the demographic of the population you intend to study. Explain the freedom to leave the study right up front. I know we talked about that earlier. But most people instinctively recognize a contract when they see one. And in most cases, if you sign one, you're bound by those terms. And so patients need to know that they have the right to leave at any time for any reason, or even for no reason at all. They don't have to explain themselves. They can walk away. Explain the role of the IRB better. I still, sitting here among you, and I know many of you are probably members of IRBs, I don't really have a clue what that means. Patients in the study need to know who is looking out for their best interests and how to contact them if the need should arise. Simply defining it as institutional review board isn't enough. That doesn't tell them anything. They need to know that if they ever feel that they're being unethically treated, that they have someone to turn to as a matter of recourse. And the appendices that we're talking about, that's new to me, as I guess it is to all the rest of us, but I feel a big red flag went up when I saw that you could put whatever else you needed to include in the appendices. And if we're not clear on who's deciding what's important to put up front, we at least need to make sure that the appendices are just as clearly written and available to the patient. That was one of my questions I had earlier that I was too afraid to ask, but when the patient is presented with the informed consent, I hope that they also receive everything included in the appendices. So how the informed consent is delivered to the patient, what it looks like, is a whole other story. I've been a printer and graphic artist all my life, And so I know the power of design to clearly convey messaging. And like a commenter said earlier, the few changes they made by including graphs, and it just made things a lot more clear for the patient. So here's my short wish list for the Informed Consent version 2.0. Break the contents up into sections that are easy to absorb, because it's hard to read long paragraphs of text, especially when you're distraught. Use bold headers to easily differentiate. This document isn't a one-time read. You can bet the patient, like I did, will be knocking on the door of every family member and friend, especially if they have any medical background, in order to get their take on this. Make it easy for them to navigate the document and share their concerns with others. Use a large font with more line spacing. 10-point Times New Roman has got to go. It's just not user-friendly, and that's all I'm saying about that. Graphics and illustrations, use them where appropriate. If you have a good spot for graphics in the document, whether it's a graph showing comparative likelihood of side effects or an image of somebody undergoing one of the tests they might have, a picture is worth 1,000 words. Collaborate with patients to design standardized templates for use. Involving patients in the design process can help you figure out what's layman-friendly and patient-friendly. Include a glossary of terms. For the terminology you have to include, which can't be further simplified, include a glossary and be able to look up, so they're able to look up terms and refer back to them. It's essential. And don't be boring, strive for engaging. So that brings me to my final slide, and I think this is the perfect forum for making a plea on behalf of the e-consent, and I'd like you to give my best reasoning on why it's so attractive. You can adjust typefaces and sizes to be more accessible, as I heard someone speaking earlier about the typeface was too small. Even my mother, who just turned 92 last week, is reading her books on a Kindle now because she's got issues with her eyesight, and being able to create a custom user experience to suit her need is everything. Multimedia, using videos or graphics to demonstrate procedures. The way we digest information as a society is rapidly evolving. I don't think there's very many among us who still get the majority of our daily news from a newspaper. We're digital, and it's time that that is reflected in the informed consent. By going digital, the ability to explain your study to a potential participant is opened wide up. If you need to explain an MRI, why not just show a video of a patient undergoing one? Or maybe if they could even make a MRI-friendly GoPro, you could have that video from the patient perspective. Remember that glossary I said you need? What if you could hover over a term and have access to a definition, a video, audio, or any other type of supporting information? And email copies for patients. You might argue what happens when the patient wants to refer to it later. Well, send them an email copy that's always available, it's portable, it's shareable, it's accessible, and it's eco-friendly. And I feel strongly that if a e-consent is thoughtfully designed, it can become a study-long guide. Imagine your informed consent being a document that acts like a virtual guide, walking the patient through every step of the journey, explaining what comes next, what to expect, and how to prepare. I think a lot of times that patients drop out of studies because they didn't realize how time-consuming it would be, what a huge impact it would have on their life, or what the procedures or tests would really be like. Addressing these issues would be so much easier in a dynamic multimedia presentation rather than on paper. Ideally, the informed consent could connect the patient to their clinical trial data later on, and they could find out the study of the status drug and even what the brand name it receives when it's approved. To be truly patient-centric, the informed consent will need to be not only shorter and in layman's terms. I think the way the guidance is currently written in the NPRM is not enough, in my opinion. It's a start, but if you at least consider some of the ideas I've presented today, it could be so much more and become a welcome and inviting doorway to participation, and rather than a scary and confusing maze that it currently is. Thank you.